Coin traders, what's going on? Thanks for joining me for the show, ICP fam. How we doing? Look at that internet computer, ICP on that ticker. Gonna actually do something a little bit different and start off on the monthly chart here and look at some of the longer term charts first. So specifically, we want to actually talk about this most recent monthly candle here and talk about this very big support level that has actually looking like it will print a close, most likely on the current month right now. So if we go ahead and look at the support line coming in at 1141, and we talk about all the months of support that we have actually seen defense of the support line. So ever since December, when we had our extremely nice big rally with our peak amount of bullish volume. Yeah, so the overall volume here has been tapering off, especially on this pullback. So month after month, these 3 months overall, and we actually haven't seen 3 consecutive months of pullback since back at the end of 2022. So not necessarily thinking we'll get that much more of it here in the shorter term. Realistically, if I had to make bets, I would actually say that this is probably going to be our last month of actually pullback. And even though we could actually see some dipping, don't think we're going to close the July candle next month in the red here. And a few more reasons why too. So I want to draw a couple more price levels for support here up on the screen, specifically looking at $8.98 just below the $9 level, and then down just above $6.50 at $6.47. So if we look at $6.47 first, big point of resistance here before pulling back, kicking off our low, and then having our very nice upside movement here. So big point of resistance that we actually blew through. In addition, looking farther left, big point of resistance for the close on the month coming just below that $9 level. So the December candle actually had a very, very huge upside move, blasted through all of these levels. And ultimately, we did end up setting this 1141 as a longer term support for about 5 months here until right now on the current candle for June, looking like a lot more decrease and break of that big support. The interesting thing about that too is a pretty decent body breaking through a lot of this downside support with basically the lowest amount of volume that we've actually seen come in bullish or bearish since October of last year. So basically, once we actually were starting the fall rally here, that's when we actually saw the next amount of less volume for the monthly. So not necessarily that much, which we don't typically expect and see on these type of pullback moves. Like we said, though, decrease in bullish volume as well. So it makes sense that we actually saw a slowdown and a top out here and do need to retrace for a little bit more of the longer term. Now, if we actually look at the amount of pullback right now, too, based on a Fibonacci from the low up to the current trend high right now, just below 21, we are going to be looking at a 78.6 retracement here down at 6739, which does align just right above where we did say for that level of closing support on this monthly. Now, if we also look at 61.8%, that's right under the $10 psychological at 978. So dipping below that right now. So if we do see a little bit more pullback, likely we will be experiencing pullbacks down to either 78.6 at 6739 or down to 647. So effectively right around 650 we think is a downside target if we do in fact continue to see a little bit more downside pressure. And like we said, over the next month, it's still entirely possible that we actually could see a potential wick down to that level before a little bit of buying pressure and a little bit more bullish action to the upside. That would be a very good and nice realistic scenario, in my opinion, for the bulls anyway, for the longer term. But one of the other things that I do want to look at here is, do want to pull up the VPVR volume profile visible range and just talk about the levels here, because if we do look here for center points of mass, over here on the side of the chart, we are pretty much dipping down to about the start of the center point of mass being right at that 650 mark. So that's kind of another reason why we think even in the event of some more downside, we're still going to be pulling back to about that level. And the great thing above that, like we said, is that's still the 78.6 retracement, which is still well above the lows that we set back in the fall. So October's lows, we were actually looking at 2877, pretty low. And then obviously on September, looking at 2825. So did set our low in October. So pretty realistic to think that even if we do continue to pull back to the 650 level, still a very good shot at setting a monthly higher low and starting to change the trend back in favor of bulls, especially given the amount of upside potential after so long of a pullback retracement and a big long accumulation phase here. Now I want to pull up the RSI Relative Strength Index, talk about some technicals for this monthly chart, and specifically as we look at the RSI, now the chart's not necessarily long enough to have a lot of data on it for this monthly, But effectively, we know that all the initial selling pressure, especially manipulated by FTX, has led to this extremely big monthly oversold RSI. So the fact that now we're actually starting to see a little bit more upside, and we actually came above the 30 line, pretty big. But over the last couple of months on this pullback and retracement, we've still had the exponential moving average for this RSI starting to climb a little bit back higher to the upside. So ideally, if you can see, we actually kicked off this exponential moving average here back when the moving average and the RSI were at 17.62. So very nice support on this EMA. What we would love to see is this EMA continue up, having this RSI, like we said, even pulling back potentially over the next month, and probably finding some sort of support off this RSI and actually continuing to trend on the upside and above the EMA here, because that will be signaling a rising strength and growing trend, especially as we do ride path of least resistance to the upside, since we are seeing that support on top of the monthly EMA for this RSI. So personally, I think it would actually take a lot to see this RSI actually cross bearish here and see a lot more pullback here. I don't think that's necessarily realistic right now, given the amount of retracement so far, the current sentiment conditions and all of that stuff. Sentiment is still extremely negative right now, so the fact that we are still seeing decreasing selling pressure does mean, especially after pulling back, that likely we are going to be experiencing that higher level of support and a higher low here, and not likely anyway to actually put in a new monthly lower low. Now switching over to the weekly chart, and we've talked on this weekly chart about how it was extremely strong and nice structure for the longer term here, just based off finding lots of support and overall not really finding a break of a lot of these price levels. But in the recent few months, obviously all of that's gone to waste as we have broken the longer term structure, especially when we have looked at the longer term support coming in here, several trend lines and price lines to ultimately be looking at, especially as we talk about price line support all the way up to about 1250 was extremely strong. And then even support zones pretty much coming in from the $11 level down to about 1050, extremely strong. So if we look at all of these and actually compare them to the zoomed in areas of the exponential moving averages, 12 did cross below the 26 right now. And so the price zone that we actually have from about 1050 to about 1008 does sit right in between the 12 and 26 and also the 50 period EMA. So a very big point of resistance as well, especially since we had a lot of support in this overall zone and region before, when we actually had a little bit more upside direction before pulling back here pretty substantially. So ever since hitting our high back towards the end of March, actually pulled back quite a lot, over 60%, over 63% here in about 14 weeks here. So about 100 days, 3.5 months or so for a pretty big pullback. Now, we were actually not expecting and experiencing ICP to have that much, especially since despite having a very good, strong upside move, a little bit more downside support would have been about a mid 40% pullback and retracement had we held this level. But ultimately, like we said, over the last few weeks, had very negative price action coming in. And especially when we take a look down at the volume, not necessarily that significant compared to what we saw during the whole upside period when we set our trend high. But what effectively happened is we're still seeing tapering off volume, but on the shorter term weekly, a little bit more of that volume pop here. So if we actually go ahead and look at the last 12 bars on this pullback, not counting the current week, which hasn't printed yet, we do only have 2 bullish weeks of upside. So just a lot of selling pressure coming in ever since hitting our trend high right now, just below the $21 level. So like we talk about with such increased bearish volume here, we do know that a bounce and a reversal is going to be coming here soon. Doesn't mean necessarily, like we talked about on the monthly, that it's just going to have a nice V-shaped recovery and kick off, but we could see a little bit of a pop before a potential retracement down to some of those lower lows in the event of a bearish scenario. I think the shorter term charts do need to see a little bit of cool down and a little bit of upside oversold bounce here playing out, but that's definitely not a guarantee of any sort of continuing price action to the upside and this being an ultimate longer term bottom here. Now, if we talk about bullish scenarios here, obviously putting any bottom would be a good thing. And with all the resistance up overhead, definitely not seeing any sort of continuation after that. So do need to probably experience some rejection and resistance off of these levels before pulling back and then setting some weekly higher lows here before continuing on again. Definitely no real reason to believe that this type of chart setup's just going to have a complete recovery. Obviously, nothing is impossible in crypto land, but pretty much what we do expect is to change the trend on the shorter term and then probably start to experience a little bit more upside gain in this level as we slowly start to knock out some of these levels. So still planning any potential bullish upside is going to take a little bit of time. Just like we've been talking about, typically summers are a little bit more on that slower side, but as long as we do see some slower and steadier growth, I think that's definitely going to be a lot better for a lot of people. And just because, you know, everyone's kind of sick of overall experiencing just continuous pullbacks. We've already been through extremely long bear markets here now. We don't want to experience 60% plus pullbacks on these moves for a prolonged, sustained period of time anyway. But yeah, so if we actually go ahead and look at some of the oscillators, starting off with the RSI and stochastic RSI, do want to actually look at stochastic RSI here first and talk about how we're extremely below the 20 line here and actually did start to drop below pretty much starting the middle of April here. So it's been a pretty long time that we actually have had the stochastic RSI below that level. And if we do actually zoom out, you can see that it hasn't necessarily been that many times on the history of this ICP Internet Computer weekly chart that we've actually seen levels this low. So if we actually talk about levels this low, we've realistically only seen 2 other times where we actually have seen prices pretty much about that point. And then if we go ahead and zoom in on all those levels pretty much coming in, starting with the middle of June in 2022, we can see that from the lows here up to the trend high there that we almost saw pretty much a 100% gain as we did bounce off of the $5 psychological support and pretty much reject almost below the $10 psychological support. And then if we go ahead and look at our next one, which did come in middle of September, and as everyone knows, that's pretty much right when we did kickstart our huge movement. So even from our low, pretty much right at the $3 level up to over 20, we're looking at about a 600% gain. So the last 2 times we had that, we did have at least 100% gain. Even if we do see only 100% from the current move, we'd still be looking at about effectively the $15 level range, which obviously does hit a pretty big resistance point up overhead, as well as looking left is a pretty big support point as well. So a lot of resistance, a lot of support, and obviously a huge psychological level as well, right at 15. Hugely speculative, not necessarily seeing that right now. Like we talked about, would actually expect a little bit more resistance smashing through some of these levels before finally getting up to that point. But the whole point that we're getting at here now is that based off of the weekly stochastic RSI, the last time that we have actually seen this, we actually did get levels that actually did see a pretty significant growth and gain here. So the fact that we are now at the bottom, so far smashed below the 20 line, we know that this has to actually travel back up to the overbought level here above the 80 line. So typically when that does happen, like we talk about, that is when we experience our little bit of upside moves here. And so even on the shorter term, when we don't get the stochastic RSI that far overextended to the bottom, we actually still get plenty of nice big upside moves here and pumps. So definitely going to be expecting that on the horizon for the longer term, obviously being patient here. But because we actually do have such strong support to the downside, and even like we talk about on this weekly chart here, plenty to look at. And so even potentially down to the closing support at 730 before dropping down to the ultimate level of support here at 650. So plenty of support to the downside based on a lot of these previous levels of resistance. So not necessarily reason to think that we're just going to blow through it without any sort of reprieve anyway. And when that does happen, we'll use volume and the magnitude of this growth to actually be our guide, whether or not it is likely to see another pullback to the downside or actually to see a weekly high or low in that instance, confirming a change of trend for the longer term chart here. Personally, if I had to make any sort of predictions and speculations, I'm still under the belief that most of the crypto sell-off is coming to a close. That's definitely not calling a bottom, but I think that we are going to be at least close to it here, even if we do see a little bit more pullback. So expecting a little bit more upside, and even with the Bitcoin sell-off yesterday, seeing most of the altcoin space rally or at least stay pretty flat was a pretty good sign, knowing that a lot of altcoins necessarily aren't going to keep dropping. Because typically when Bitcoin drops, we would have normally and historically seen that kind of a day be about a 20% pullback for a lot of altcoins, given that Bitcoin pulled back for about 6%. So now I did want to turn on VPVR for this weekly as well, because like we said, so much support on the downside, and right now we do have a lot of resistance up overhead, and we talked about the targets being pretty much mid 11 to about the $12 level. And so looking on the point of masses for trading volume here at those price levels as well, pretty much all the way up to the $13 level. So pretty much from 11.50 all the way up to 13. So even if we do get that bounce, like we said in experience, probably going to see some sort of resistance there coming in, especially around the exponential moving averages here, because we do know that those are going to be heading to the downside and looking for a cross. So probably going to be experiencing a little bit more resistance coming in pretty much right around the $10 psychological level first, if I ultimately had to guess here. So now looking at the daily chart and talking about more on the shorter term, especially since daily is a little bit longer, but do want to talk about the overall pattern and setup right now, because like we talked about, we put in our low right now, and like we said, low for that is 758. Not necessarily a lot of increased volume follow through here on this potential bounce attempt, and especially with these exponential moving averages overhead, still could be a scenario to actually see prices more or less go sideways before the next potential pullback. So that is the bearish case scenario here. Obviously, what we would love to see, especially with some resistance points on the daily overhead, and for those, we are going to be looking at a closing level of resistance right at 840. I think if we can actually find a break and close on top of that level, as well as breaking through this 12-period EMA, that's going to be one of the bullish signs and factors. So we could actually see a rejection first before finding a higher low on the daily, compared to that low that we talked about at 758. That could be a very potential scenario too, forming ultimately a little bit more of that higher low to make higher highs and starting to change the trend. Obviously not immediately, but taking a little bit more time, but making sure that it is a strong and secured bottom here, bouncing off and defending support, especially ensuring a higher low comes in on the daily. Overall, though, just based off of how much resistance overhead and how much we're actually getting stuck up on these exponential moving averages and how wide they are, it is going to take a long period of time, though, before Internet Computer ICP actually sees a reversal and potential new for break of trends and some higher highs here. So like we said, pretty much going to be expecting another several weeks here and potentially several months here as we do right out the summer uneventfully for most of the crypto space. Hopefully getting a little bit of hype coming in, but overall, definitely not necessarily expecting anything, so this is a good time to keep stacking and dollar cost averaging as prices are still low and dipping, especially so substantially from their most recent trend highs. Not financial advice, obviously, but dollar cost averaging is pretty much the best strategy for most people in this space, and obviously it does lead to about the most success that you can get for the longer term here. But yeah, like we said, not financial advice, obviously, of course, just some personal suggestions based off of years of experience in this overall crypto space and some trading. But otherwise, that is going to go ahead and wrap up the video and show for today on ICP Internet Computer. Hope you all enjoyed, and if you like this longer term chart format here, looking at some of the longer candles and time frames, definitely drop me a note in the comments sections below. And hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please hit the thumbs up, like, and subscribe if you have not done so just yet. Otherwise, don't forget to reach out over on Twitter or X at coin_trades is the handle. Chat with you all over there. Appreciate all the continuous love and support, as always, does mean so much. Stay safe, take care, coin traders, and I will catch you back in the next video. See ya.